Americans, what's the biggest reverse culture shock you've had upon returning? Story 1. How uncommon it is to see people smoking cigarettes in the US. I didn't realize how much smoking had gone away here until I went to the UK. If it wasn't cigarettes, it was vapes. Seemed like every other person, young and old, had a vape. Haven't seen that amount of smoking since I was a kid, and we had smoking sections in restaurants. It's quite truly unbelievable how much this changed since the early 2000s. It never ever used to be this way at all. It's an area where state legal changes truly drove widespread cultural changes. It would be a fascinating story to explore if it hadn't already. And some of all that tobacco settlement money, to the extent it remains, could be a way to fund that kind of study. I remember being a little girl and we had a week in school dedicated to the dangers of smoking. We were encouraged to talk to our elders at home and in our community about the dangers. So I told my mom that I was going to talk to Grandma, and my mom was basically like, "Girl, do it at your own risk." I remember being so confident of all I had learned, and my grandma just looked at me with the stank eye. I had a knowing that I had crossed the line and I shouldn't do that again. But at school, they really pushed this into us, and I really saw smoking as bad. I never touched them. I went to New York a couple of weeks ago, and I was shocked at the amount of weed people are smoking on the street and the potency. I'm not against weed in any way. On the contrary, yay cannabis for people who enjoy that, but I am against public smoking, outside of designated smoking areas. It was everywhere. Is this a New York-specific thing, or does it also happen in other large cities in the US? If so, I feel like your comment isn't that accurate. One of my first real jobs was at a large bakery. They had just divided the smoking and non-smoking break rooms. About a year in, I was asked to clean the purifier and the smoking one. It was nasty and thick. That should be enough to make anyone not want to smoke, not to mention that the smoking room was yellow and the other was white, even though they were both painted white a year earlier. Story 2. Lived in Russia for 18 months. This was over 10 years ago. When I came back to the US, I spent a week in New York City and was taken aback at how nice everyone was and how crappy the subway was. When my wife and I visited New York City, we were super jet-lagged, flying in from Europe. Our first trip in the subway honestly felt like it was taken out of a movie or TV show. An Orthodox Jew, a Muslim, and some other dudes were jovially discussing the best route somewhere. We must have looked very jet-lagged because a dude who I'm pretty sure was homeless asked us where we were going and offered to help us get there. When we got off at the stop he said was the right one, he just ambled over, opened the emergency exit, and waved us through. We kinda panicked about that until we saw the rest of the people on their way out. We're like, oh, someone opened the shortcut, nice, and walked through. He showed us how to get to the hotel, and we got there super fast. He didn't want any money or food or anything. He just helped us. I didn't think New York City was any more or less rude than anywhere else I've visited in the States. It's one of my favorite cities I've visited in the US. I didn't grow up in New York, but living here, the thing I always see is people are very hard on the outside towards strangers, but it takes like 10 seconds and they're the nicest people ever. I had an IT job where I had to travel all over Western New York to upgrade medical software, and every time it was the same. Show up, people are cold, and it would take like 10 seconds of not being an a-hole, and they wanted to invite you over for a football game. I've lived in a few places in the US, and my opinions are, in New York, people are guarded and hard, but you show you're nice and they will be the nicest people in the world. Oklahoma, people use niceness as a tool. Everyone will be super nice at the offset, but they will stab you in the back the second it benefits them and call you the jerk for getting punked. Oregon, people act nice and also are nice, and expect everyone else to be too. People smile at each other on the street and it's earnest. If someone fell on the sidewalk, you'd have people looking to help you. It actually freaks out people from the East Coast. They think people in Oregon are just trying to pull one over on them. That's how I feel every time I visit Texas. Like, Texas has such a bad rep in Germany. Watch out, everyone carries a gun, wears a cowboy hat, and is out to commit armed robbery. Especially you, tourist, you will get shot. Whenever I went to a store, people seemed so awfully nice. I bought a small box of football cards at Target, and the older lady at the register lit up and talked about how she found some older baseball cards from the 80s the other day. She was just so happy to share her story with someone who has a similar hobby. That thing always stuck with me, because when I get to a German cash register, they scan your crap and tell you the amount in a professional tone, which means sounding like a robot. especially when they ask if you have some better change, and don't really care too much about interaction. Another story was in 2018 when I was at a Walmart in Texas. I was just walking down an aisle and suddenly someone from across the aisle yelled, "Hey man, I like your shirt." I was startled when I turned around and it was a random employee who noticed my wrestling shirt from afar, had a nice short talk and went our separate ways afterwards. It feels very human in most interactions. Of course, you still need to know professionalism at your job, but it's these small interactions where you remember that there's still a human being there, and that will make their day. Story 3. Going from Japanese customer service to US customer service is a colossal downgrade. The assumption in the US is that you're complaining for its sake. The assumption in many countries in Asia, sans China, where arguing about price is kind of a pastime outside of big department stores, is that you have a complaint, it probably actually bothered you to the point you'd actually try to contact someone about it, instead of just dealing with it. My wife and I got extremely lost in a large train station in Japan, and we had 3 employees helping us find our way. They were legit concerned, and we all celebrated when we figured out the issue. One of them even gave us his personal number to call him in case anything went wrong. We went back there the next day with a Starbucks gift card for each of them as a thank you. This is a double-edged sword, though. The omotenashi concept of extreme customer service, smiles, politeness, and attention, can be a bit annoying. When people are extremely polite to you, you feel an obligation to be extremely polite back, and over time, this can be mentally exhausting. When I go back to the US and the clerk at the gas station is really casual with, "Hey, what's up?" That's refreshing. I don't have to be really polite back, I can just be casual. It's not as special, I guess, but it's just more chill. Source, I have lived in Tokyo for 20 years. Hell no! Japanese customer service treats you like a child, and God forbid you have a niche or off-manual request. Maybe tourists have a good time because they're incapable of asking or aren't around long enough to find themselves in a situation that needs it. Whenever I hear this, I always think of when after living here for years, I got a craving for a McChicken. They had a chicken crisp, which is similar but a different sauce. I asked for no sauce, which is fine. Then I asked if they could add mayonnaise, and they froze. And after a few moments of panic and deliberation, they told me no because that would be a different menu item. I was flabbergasted. America quite often does not give a crap, but at least if you ask for something, they'll do it. Sometimes they even go out of their way. Something breaks or you have a problem, they often compensate you for the trouble. Japanese often just say sorry and tough luck. There are rarely attempts to make things right, like in the US. Even the small talk and friendliness are sorely missed. You just feel like you're interacting with humans and they are treating you like one too. I don't find the Japanese robotic politeness all that endearing in comparison. It feels fake and incredibly insincere. Japanese customer service is overall quite trash on all service levels. You've got to go out of your way for good customer service here. Just go to your average Japanese dentist and then tell me how good you think it still is. Story 4. It took me a second to remember that the first floor is the ground/lobby floor here every time I get in an elevator for a few weeks. The reason why Europe has it this way is that for a lot of our history, the ground floor was actually just the ground. The walls were put up, but the floor was just dirt. So the first floor was the first level that had to be constructed for it to exist. In the US, you build a level a couple of feet off the ground with a crawl space under it. So the first floor that was built was at the bottom of the building, and you didn't use the ground at all. That's not always the case. The button with the star is the ground floor for that elevator. There are quite a few hotels, convention centers, and medical facilities I've been in where the ground was in the parking garage or even on the second or third floor depending on what part of the building you were on. My first university had S1, subterranean, as the ground on one side, first on the central and second floor on the other end because it was built on a fairly steep hill. Nobody will read. In many areas of America, you're taxed or restricted based on floor count. When buildings have floors that aren't 1, 2, 3, it's to cheat taxes and regulations. Let's say you are a giant company and some cities say that you can't build over 4 floors, but think about houses on a slope where the living room might be a floor above the back door, and both are on the ground. So who's to say what the first floor is? Most cities allow for this exemption, so you can have 4 floors, a ground floor, and maybe they allow a basement and a sub-basement, so you can sneak in 7 floors where the law normally allows 4 to 5. Basements are usually required for tall buildings, so kind of ignore the first basement. What about a mezzanine? Some areas allow buildings of a certain size to have some special floors not used for normal business. For example, there could be a mezzanine, which is like a coffee shop and public meeting area, not counted as a business floor, and maybe they also allow a service floor. Sometimes if you hold 2 buttons or use a key, the elevator stops between numbered floors, and this is a secret floor for storage and mechanical stuff. I went to college in a city that maxed out at 24 floors. They built a giant dorm for students that was on at least 26 floors, ground, mezzanine, 1 through 24, and basements. I never counted, but I would bet there were 1 to 2 mechanical floors hidden between normal floors too. Story 5. Returned to the US from India, sat down to eat at a restaurant at the airport, and the waiter immediately brought me a glass of iced water. It took me a moment to realize that it was safe to drink here. Went to India with my wife in 2015 for her non-profit work and spent some time in a small city. Our anniversary happened to be during our time. So we went out for dinner at a local restaurant outside of the hotel. We may have been some of the first white people they had ever served. It was hilarious to see the waiter solemnly bring us 2 cups of water, come frantically tearing back in 30 seconds later to take them away, and then solemnly bring us 2 empty cups and a bottle of water. That poor dude, he was doing his best to take care of the foreigners, and we loved it. I returned from a long stay in India, and for a while after I got back to the US, I would just drink water directly from the tap just because I could. I also swallowed shower water a few times on purpose because I was so afraid in India to get water inside my mouth. Don't get me wrong, my first time in India was incredible and I'd go back in a heartbeat, but it did give me an appreciation for clean water that I never had before. Unlearning that water is safe and toilet paper can go into the toilet were my 2 biggest takeaways from living in Morocco and Jordan. Also, I don't have to light a propane heater to take a strictly 2-minute shower. Morocco. ETA, I don't need to squeeze the bathroom after, and there aren't days you can't run water. There was 1 day a week in Amman that you had unlimited water and everyone would hose down their houses, cars, driveways. Other than that, you had to limit your water usage. Story 6. The massive amount of advertising and upsells as soon as you get on a plane back to the US. It's all, sign up for this credit card, watch these ads before and after the safety briefing, and you can pay later for all this, no payments today. It's absolutely screaming into your brain at every opportunity. Marketing is softcore terrorism. I used to work in psychological operations for the Army, and you have no idea how manicured everything is in order to influence your decisions. We didn't practice what we learned on our countrymen, but it was easy to see what we learned was being practiced by corporations, the media, etc. I've been to a few countries, and on my last trip I rented a car in Ireland. I couldn't believe there wasn't an advertisement to watch while I pumped gas. I also couldn't believe I could pump before going inside to pay. I haven't done that in the States since around 2012. I returned to the US after living in Central Europe for 27 years. I totally 1000% relate to this. The number of micro decisions Americans are asked to make every day was and still is overwhelming to me. Do you want to round up your purchase price for this charity? Apply for this credit card to save $20 on your order? Do you want a receipt? Do you want a car wash with your gas purchase? Do you want fries with that? Do you want to tip 18, 20 to 25%? Subscribe and save. Free trial for 1 month, etc., etc., on and on. It's exhausting to me, and I think many Americans isolate themselves rationally in order to preserve a few shreds of emotional energy. It's toxic, and the label of softcore terrorism strikes me as totally fitting. I pride myself on my ability to evade ads in the US. I use a search engine with no ads. I have YouTube Premium. For any streaming services, I always get the ad-free version. For sports events, I always start an hour late so I can just skip the ads. I don't watch cable TV. I have ad-free Spotify and don't listen to the radio. I use an ad blocker online. My data is worthless because it's so difficult to actually serve me an ad that I would actually see. Story 7. Music in restaurants is so loud. And bars too. It's ridiculous. They say it encourages more drinking, but for me it means I'm finishing my drink and leaving because I can't hear the person sitting right next to me. This is not even a one-sided thing. It's gotten out of control in restaurants in America. Sometimes it's like, what the hell is going on? How can people sit here and enjoy themselves? Meanwhile, there's a guy in the corner on the freaking mic with a random-looking guitar blasting his dumpy music so loud that you can't even hear what the waiter is saying to you in your ear. God, it drives me crazy. We had one restaurant we could take my grandma with dementia to because it was the only place that didn't blast music and she loved going to restaurants. They got bought out and the new owners started blasting music. The first time my mom asked if they could turn it down for a little while and explained what was up with my grandma to the manager, they turned it down and then my mom watched the manager walk over every few minutes to slowly turn the music back up until it was as loud or louder than it had originally been. They do that to increase tips. If it's nice and peaceful, people will stick around and chat with each other long after their meal is finished. In other countries that aren't so gratuity incentivized, they pay their serving staff a living wage and don't expect tips. Therefore, there is no incentive for the serving staff to hustle people out of the door in order to be able to seat another group, and thus get another tip. Like in Germany, you can sit at a table after a meal for an hour and they won't say a thing, but in the US you are promptly pushed out to be able to serve the next round as quickly as possible. Having the music up louder is just another passive way to encourage you to move on and have your conversation elsewhere. Story 8. Going into an American grocery store after years abroad is overwhelming but also glorious. Yes, this is so true. I missed access to all of my favorite snacks as well as having actual healthy snack options, but then I ended up being so overwhelmed. Since when are there 6 flavors of roasted almonds? Whoa, I totally forgot we have more than a single option for milk. How do I choose between the 17 different bags of popcorn? And what is this $3.99 per yogurt? 5 years ago. Why does yogurt need to cost $3.99? When is yogurt $3.99 for a single yogurt? Why is there a big video screen of me literally scanning my items above the self-checkout? Is that really necessary? Why does this thing effing hate when I use my own shopping bags, and why are there 0 actual cashiers? This was my first thought after coming home from France. That and 24-hour or late-night stores, although COVID did kind of kill that where I am in the US, and most close between 10 and midnight now, also full-size appliances. I had a cheap apartment there that only had a mini fridge, a hot plate, and countertop oven, so I had to buy groceries every couple of days due to the lack of space like I was used to in America. I left pre-COVID and went back a couple of years ago for a visit. Went to impoverished Central Asia where the produce that's in season is what you get, but is generally very inexpensive. I was dazed going down aisles, seeing stuff like keto waffles coming from a country where you're lucky to find the meat behind the counter isn't halfway spoiled. Also, the prices were a shocker. From like $1 for a kilogram of peppers to $1.50 each. Actually, on my way back to the States right now doing a stopover. Will be my first Thanksgiving and Christmas at home in like 6 years. Story 9. Coming back to the US from Cairo, I did not need to be so alert all the time. There's a lot to like about Cairo, but it is a tourist city and a lot of the businesses and locales take advantage of the tourists. It's a little thing, but you have to be ready to argue vehemently about every price and service. I didn't realize how much that was stressing me until I came home. This is generally my answer when people ask, why did you come back? I studied in France, went abroad as soon as I graduated, lived in China for a few years, and Ecuador for a year after that. Even in China, when I felt totally safe the whole time, you always have to be on. You always have to be processing things in a different language. You always feel foreign. You always have to make sure you're not being ripped off, and the food is always different from what you grew up with. It's a constant slight awareness of just otherness. I have the deepest respect for people who permanently move to a different country, especially living in their second language. Same here. I lived in France for a year. I remember the sheer exhaustion of having to do everything in your non-native language day after day after day. I hoped it would get easier over time, but it didn't for me. My language skills definitely improved, but the mental exhaustion was still there. Mad props to those who come here to the US and have to learn or speak English all day, every day. It cannot be easy. I lived in the UK for a bit, in a rural area while doing an agricultural work visa program. Even with no language barrier and a more similar culture, I felt the same way. It was the little things, remembering which way to look before crossing the street, exchanging currency in my head to understand value, remember to say uni, not college. Another big part was because I was living in a rural area, I was the only foreigner around, so I was often put on the spot and grilled about my own country, and was subject to a lot of stereotypes. I couldn't imagine doing all that with a language barrier and in a more unfamiliar culture. This is true of a lot of countries. My parents grew up in India and negotiation is a part of life. When we'd visit, they would haggle incessantly, sometimes teasing each other, but in a dialogue that was uncomfortable to me as a kid raised in the US. By that I mean telling a merchant his goods weren't that great anyway and that they were cheating them, while the merchant would tell my parents to move along then, he didn't need their business or whatever. But it was like a song and dance they all knew the script to and would finally agree on a price. I've never been good at haggling because of growing up in the States. We just don't do that. It is quite stressful if you're not used to it. Egypt is just like that. I lived there for a little more than 2 years, and it took me a year to understand how much negotiations are a part of life. In local shops, nothing has a price tag, and if you don't negotiate, you will get absolutely robbed. Humorously, if you don't at least put a good effort in on negotiations, the person selling you will sometimes be upset or disappointed. Like they are mad because if you didn't fight much, maybe they could have gotten more from you. I understood how much negotiations were a part of daily life when we brought a bunch of our Egyptian engineers back to the US for a design review. They all went down to the front desk and complained. Their room wasn't big enough, they wanted a discount because they thought it could be cleaner or didn't have a good view. They wanted free breakfast because they were paying a high rate. They were just doing what you have to do in an Egyptian hotel to get a good deal. Story 10. Returned to the US from Korea. It gets talked about all the time, but just how unnecessarily complicated and inconvenient our healthcare system is. To go from a system where you can go see a doctor or specialist any day of the week without an appointment, to know that you will be covered, and to have the peace of mind that you'll spend probably less than $20, to then go to whatever we have here. It's just absurd to me. I also pay twice for my healthcare here than I did in Korea. We are so duped by a system that is openly robbing us and not keeping us well. As a Korean, I will never take our healthcare for granted. When I found out how much it cost my friend to get her wisdom teeth removed in the US versus the $20 it cost me to remove mine, I was floored. It's a big but in my thought process about considering move back to the US. It's no pure coincidence that I'm in Vietnam and nearly every single American I know has often done their major dentistry and medical stuff here. Even paying out of pocket for private care at an international hospital, people still paid less than in the US. One example, a friend of mine had a hernia operation, and back home in the US he'd have been looking at a bill of $20K plus. Here in Vietnam, at a top international hospital in my city, he paid less than $900 for all the costs. Story 11. Moved from Singapore and then back to the US. 3 biggest shocks. 1. Unlike Singapore, I can't expect everyone to know English in California. 2. An American striking a random conversation is normal. And 3. Mexican food is the most American food around. Not an American, but a man living in the Philippines. The American food felt like a cruel prank. Took me ages to learn not to order nachos or burgers anywhere that wasn't specifically a Mexican or European restaurant because disappointment was immeasurable when you received your unseasoned ground pork between 2 savory bread halves and no condiments or other layers except maybe a small squeeze of mayo. Or the bottom shelf value cheese whiz and spaghetti sauce on cassava chips and sweet corn kernels that were nachos. It really depends on where you are in the US. There are some parts of the US where Mexican food just isn't as commonplace as California or Texas, and what they have isn't nearly as good, unless you consider Taco Time or Taco Bell Mexican food, and/or good Mexican food. Also, in general, California isn't representative of all of the US, especially if you're talking about the big metro areas like LA and SF. Try going to Maine or the Deep South. Very different from California. My husband is in the USAF, and we are stationed in the UK. A year or so ago, he went to TDY for a few months in Spain. He and his buddies heard there was a bomb-ass Mexican restaurant there. For anyone who isn't aware, Mexican food is rare in the UK, and whenever you do find it, it's an absolute ass. So they went to find this spot, and after sitting down for a while, they realized every table seemed to be speaking English, like American English, so they started asking around, and just about every person in that Mexican restaurant was American. Do you know who loves Mexican food the most? Americans. Story 12. Flying from Shanghai back to Dallas was the biggest culture shock for me. Shanghai makes Dallas look like a ghost town. And the maglev train that runs over the city gives you a sense of scale like no other. Imagine being in a jet flying over a city that just seems to never end. Did the same thing, but Shenzhen and New York City. Shenzhen makes New York City look so outdated, dilapidated, and underpopulated. I still can't forget the beautiful humming sound of the subway train accelerating, unlike the wooden roller coaster sound of the New York City subway. Because the US pretty much built their cities 100 to 150 years ago and then stopped major investment projects into them save for personal investment for the ultra-wealthy, instead of building massive urban sprawl into suburbia, Asian cities also don't tend to preserve old historical buildings in the same way North American or European countries do. So when a large infrastructure project happens in places like Shenzhen, there is much less resistance. Not that it's permitted, to knocking down vast parts of the city to build that new infrastructure. When I moved back to Nashville after living 6 months in Shanghai, I was genuinely baffled for the first month or so at not seeing only Chinese people every day. It's definitely a cosmopolitan city, no question, but Nashville is a majorly diverse immigrant city. I was there a bit when I moved to New York City shortly after, especially got a bit of whiplash because I was living in my grandparents' neighborhood in Harlem but working in the heart of Chinatown. Story 13. After living in Korea and Japan, I will always forever appreciate the independence/individualism of American culture. Especially in Korea. I felt like I joined a gang/cult when I realized even the simplest of tasks required the consensus of the entire office. I saw a 46-year-old who felt like he didn't have enough authority to print papers in the printer, so we had to wait and ask the office superior hours later. It's hard to describe in a small post. I just feel like there's a certain kind of autonomy that exists here that doesn't exist over there with regard to work. Just left after working in South Korea for years, and I know exactly what that work culture is that you're talking about. It's like, unless something is perfectly in line with someone's job expectations, it won't get done. Even if it's as small as printing something in a printer they don't normally use. It's draining. I can't count how many times I tried to get something done and was blocked by some wildly arbitrary obstacle. A million years ago, I was on a kind of school trip to the University of Tokyo. Our hosts were going to do some kind of presentation in a lecture hall, but the overhead projector was broken. It took them forever to find someone who could find someone who could find a professor, this was on a weekend, who had the authority to say that yes, it was okay to temporarily borrow one from the next lecture hall. Completely empty, nothing booked. It was the weekend, remember? And to leave a note for building maintenance to fix it Monday morning. The worst combination of not wanting to inconvenience anyone ever combined with a pathological need for the required authority in order to do something. Anything. Zero personal initiative. I also lived in Korea and Japan. There are definitely pros and cons to individualism and collectivism. I do miss the general common courtesy and respect most people have towards others in Asia. In the US, it tends to lean towards screwing everyone else. It's me versus you. You're much more likely to have people who don't have basic manners. That said, this could be a bad thing too, depending on the situation, especially when people are polite to the point of wearing two faces. I also don't miss working in Korean and Japanese offices. Your example gave me PTSD. Never again. Having spent a year in Korea, I noticed something interesting/weird that I just can't get over. People generally just wait after work to see if the boss or manager wants to go out for fried chicken and beer or some other drinking outing or not. They literally waited after work to see if a social event would be required. It was like that was just the unspoken rule. If the boss wants to go, everyone needs to be ready to go. I joined one time, and after that I didn't feel like going out. They were like, he is American, it's okay. It wouldn't have been acceptable for one of the Koreans to just say, I don't feel like drinking today, so I'm going to go home now, and leave. Maybe it was just the one office I worked at, but when I asked them, they said this was pretty normal office routine. Story 14. Having to drive everywhere. Dublin isn't the most bike-friendly place, but living there for several years and being able to hop on my bike and get across town in 20 minutes is something I will always miss. After being back in Illinois for 2 years, I still hate that I have to drive 2 miles to Target because that's the only option for getting there and home in one piece. ETA, at no point did I say I live in Chicago. I don't have city public transit and resources, thus my comment. Yeah, I feel that. I'm from Cork, but I live in Chicago. Driving everywhere sucks. I love being back in Cork and arriving in the city center and being like, right, quick haircut, and I'll head over to meet my dad for lunch, pop into Penny's or stop off at the pea shop for some juice, and then head over to Douglas to meet the friends for the match, and it's all walkable. I really miss that. I miss the sense of community in Ireland too. You don't really get that in the US, not in the same way at least. If the housing crisis wasn't such a crisis back home, I would move back. This is a huge one for me too. I always disliked being reliant on cars to start with. It's such an expense, and you never know what will go wrong at the worst time. Then I was spoiled by having 2 bus stops right outside my door, and never truly needing to drive anywhere for years. For the most part, anywhere I needed to go was easily reached via foot/bus/train. The few times we did want a car for a road trip, we just rented one. It worked fine for us. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.